Welcome everyone to this is our third online panel session for the PSA Media and Politics group. I'm Emily Harmer. I'm one of the co-conveners of the group, and we kind of set up this series this year for obvious reasons so that we could all meet online. So today I'm delighted to welcome Emma Briant and Natalie Martin, and we're hoping to have a special guest, Carole Cadwalladr, join us to offer some commentary on the two papers that we're going to be listening to today. So I think Emma's going to speak first, right? And then Natalie's going to follow up. So what I'll do now is stop sharing my screen so that Emma can share hers, and we'll start off whenever you're ready.
Thank you. And I want to say a special thank you to Natalie and Emily and the Media and Politics group, who was so welcoming when I first started as a PhD student, and who I presented for my very first conference, which was very scary. This is less scary. But I wanted to say a special thank you for bringing me back. I'm going to be talking today about neurotargeting and influence operations, from PSYOP to politics, and the special case of Cambridge Analytica, which I obviously know a lot about, having been involved in 2018 in revealing substantial wrongdoing by the firm relating to their data exposures on Facebook targeting. So I'm gonna launch straight into some stuff I think is really interesting from my background in, has been in information warfare and researching what our militaries do with propaganda. And I sort of transitioned into looking more at political campaigns later, although my first book is actually on reporting of political campaigns in relation to refugees. My primary area of expertise is counterterrorism communications. And I was interested to discover that SCL, the parent company of Cambridge Analytica, were among the first people, looking at neurotargeting and how that was being used in counterterrorism, ways of essentially researching the brain to sort of predict and potentially manipulate audiences' behavior and decision making. Now, this is neuromarketing is a tactic that is used commercially as well, and it's something that was really in development during the days when SCL, Cambridge Analytica's parent company, were expanding in counterterrorism in their defense contracts, and trying to find new ways to understand audiences. Now, I got a couple of completely non-Cambridge Analytica related examples here. One from 2011, as you can see, headsets were being developed at this time for sort of analyzing your emotions, to try and sort of mind read essentially and control computers with your mind. So that, neuroscientists have been working for a long time on remote ways of using the brain to control, but also ways of better understanding how we read and process, and how communications are translated into behaviors by our brains. So one of the things that's interesting is how this has been researched for more nefarious purposes, such as by authoritarian countries, which are trying to use this brain surveillance devices and so on for control. Now, how effective this is a little bit beyond me. I'm not a neuroscientist. And I believe that this is, not as perfected science yet. However, in 2013, I interviewed Lee Rowland from SCL's sort of research hub, the Behavioral Dynamics Institute. And he told me that, you know, they were very interested in this area. He said, you're going to be able to remotely derive and implement influence and behavioral campaigns. He was very, you know, dismissive of the ethics of this. He thought this was really very concerning, to just emphasize that this, you know, he was worried about the ways that this could be abused as well. And, you know, he was writing about these technological advances. Now, these are, you know, methods that SCL were looking at to try and understand terrorists, for example. And then very much later in 2020, as you can see on the right, there's been some reporting of, how this has been used for terrorism and understanding terrorism by this researcher called Nafeez Hamid. And he claims to be the first person to have ever done this, vastly later than SCL were working on it. So I don't know if they were the first to work on it, but they're the first I've seen to be working on this in collaboration with neuroscientists. So that is, I think, some interesting background on why and how this company became very interested in how emotions and our, you know, impulses and so on might be able to be utilized in campaigns. As I said, this was science that was in development. Lee Rowland said that this was 20, 30 years off. So what were they trying to do? What data was out there that they could use that was more actionable? Well, this is where we come to social media data, okay? Now, it might not be your brainwaves that they would be analyzing and the indicators of your emotions coming directly from, you know, brain scans, that this kind of technology that they were interested in was underpinned by. But it, you know, they obviously were trying to find other data that might indicate how our brains react to different stimuli. So I look at their ocean analysis in a little bit of a different way to many of the scientists that have been talking about their analytics and data analytics. The analysis of Cambridge Analytica's methods has mostly focused on effectiveness and has really not explored the nuances of what they were trying to do or what they were doing and what the dangers might be. So some political scientists, Brendan Nyan, Dave Karff, Dave Sumter, and others were quite dismissive of the methods, saying that they didn't work. Now, this was generally researching how ocean performed across the whole, you know, all of these categories in campaigns. But I think we need to be paying more attention to the focus on neuroticism. For the most part, most of their methodology didn't seem to work even for them. They knew this, but neuroticism did. It seemed to create much greater engagement by audiences when targeting audiences that are categorized as neurotic with fear-based messaging. So this is what they did, essentially, a lot of experiments around this for Make America #1 pack, including the Crooked Hillary campaign. Neuroticism data obviously also, you know, relates to our, you know, if we're neurotic, we may be more, have more of a propensity to anxiety. And a film that I assisted last year called People You May Know, which was by Charles Creel and Kat Gillen, and with the lead researcher, Brent Allpress, explores extensively how Cambridge Analytica worked with a company called Glue for non-profits in the United States that were trying to roll out a digital app for the churches to better understand their congregations, their communities, and to target services such as support for grief counseling and relationship strain and prevent divorce and things like this. Many activities that the churches always engage in and are perfectly legitimate to supporting communities. But this Briant and the film team were able to show that this was being repurposed for political targeting. Now, I did a lot of work on researching around this myself to try to prove this, that Cambridge Analytica actually worked on the data. And I managed to obtain emails and interviews that showed Cambridge Analytica's role, which I'm yet to publish, but I'm going to talk about it a little today. This was essentially an app funded by the Philanthropy Roundtable, a Koch-funded non-profit, which is not supposed to be working in any way in politics in the US. Several $1 million were invested. And after the film came out, GLUE put out a statement on the left saying that we never did business with or traded information with Cambridge Analytica, which is absolutely false. And I'm showing a couple of the emails that I'm going to publish here that, essentially show their engagement. The vice president of the organization communicating with Cambridge Analytica, Alexander Nix, confirmed that this could be actioned, and the data that was received from their analysis was actually being included into Cambridge Analytica's political surveys. The GLUE and the Philanthropy Roundtable made requests of Cambridge Analytica for several different categories of analysis. So they were looking at how church going could be essentially incentivized to enable political targeting. And they were especially interested in how white churchgoers could be turned into Republicans. They were not very interested in Black churchgoers and literally requested, would it be possible to take a look at the primary voters on both parties broken down by church attendance, but with Black voters removed from the analysis? So they racially modeled the data. Cambridge Analytica racially modeled the data for GLUE and then included it into their campaign surveys. Now, we know also that Cambridge Analytica data was passed to Russian oligarchs. If we look at the volume 5 of the Senate Intelligence Committee report, it's very concerning that this data was being treated this way. I want to highlight that Brent Allpress has found evidence linking the data set to the Stop the Steal campaign, which was the run-up essentially to the January 6th violence. I'll repeat again, GLUE deny any involvement in politics, deny any relationship to Cambridge Analytica, but the evidence here is really very strong. Why should we think carefully about sharing our indicators of our mental health? I mean, we are trying to make people feel more comfortable around mental health. Mental health is incredibly important to reassure people that it's okay to speak out. However, people are more and more sharing information about their, depression and so forth online. And I would say that this carries a risk because you are essentially making public data that can be utilized in campaigns that might well be seeking to advance paranoid conspiracy theories. This data, the fact that this data set was being shared politically, when it's been modeled on, categories such as depression, anxiety, you know, financial stress and relationship stress is very concerning, particularly when we consider that 35 of known QAnon followers who were arrested for extremist crimes in the US, not including the Capitol breach, 63% had a documented mental health condition. Neuroticism is an indicator of anxiety and tendency to worry. In absence of actual mental health data, so prior to the modeling, that this would be a really important factor. If you look at during the pandemic, so during the key period in the run-up to these awful riots in the United States, there was 40% of US adults were struggling during the pandemic with mental health and substance use. I don't want us to panic about mental health. What I want us to do is to consider the importance of protecting vulnerable categories of people, okay? The research that evaluated Cambridge Analytica's effectiveness really neglected the very particular targeting of neurotics and of depression, essentially, in this repurposing of data by glue. And the mental health context of the campaigns. This is something that hasn't gone away, unfortunately, with the collapse of Cambridge Analytica. Patrick Fagan, the lead psychologist with CA, has been working with the HARP group, a anti-vax group, to help them with their campaign and targeting. So there's, I've managed to obtain chaps that were originally obtained by DDoS secrets, which show, as you can see, that he's recommending, the psychological makeup that should be considered for targeting people who want mandatory wearing of face masks. And he stresses that these people are more neurotic. So what I'm concerned with is, here he's clearly saying if messaging shows face masks are unfair and harmful, that would be very powerful with these groups. I want more attention around like effectiveness, or like not just even effectiveness, but what is the effect on us if we are neurotics of this kind of messaging. This has not been adequately explored, and I think is a really concerning area of development for influence campaigns, which has been really very overlooked. All the focus in recent years has been on disinformation as in falsehood. And we need to be focusing more on data-driven fear and understanding what it is, what is the effect on anybody with mental health challenges, and also with particular personality types like neuroticism, where people may well be more inclined towards worry and anxiety. Thank you very much for listening. I hope I haven't gone over time. I'm trying to keep an eye on it, but anyway, thank you, and I'm looking forward to questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Emma. If you can unshare your screen, we'll move swiftly on to Natalie.
Hello everyone, thanks for coming. I believe we now have Carole in the audience as well, so that's great news. I'll keep this relatively short, bear with me. I'm just going to attempt to share my screen, which is always easier said than done. There, can you all see that? Yeah,
yep, we can see.
Good. Yep. Okay, let me just do the ultimate. Do that, yeah. Excellent, right, okay, so I'll keep this brief, and in the spirit of keeping it brief, I'm going to tell you my conclusions first. So my conclusion is that Carole Cadwalladr was targeted with dis, mis and malinformation, but mostly dis and mal actually, over her Brexit coverage. I'll explain why I'm saying that. I'll say much of the disinformation, broadly defined, was gendered, although gender probably wasn't the overall major motivation. It was with some of the actors, but not all of them. And they weren't all primarily driven by kind of bringing down female journalists, although it may appear that way. I will argue that journalism was actually the primary target because of the jeopardy posed by Carole Cadwalladr's journalism, which is very powerful. But her gender was weaponized, you know, as a form of malinformation. So basically malinformation means that it's true, yeah, she's female, but being female is seen as a weakness and therefore it's weaponizable. So let me go into that in a little bit more detail. So disinformation. One of the problems we have with using the term disinformation is that it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people because it's been used in different ways over time. So over time, it's been a synonym for propaganda. It's been, you know, more recently, it's a synonym, it's often used synonymously, I should say, for fake news. They are similar, but they're not the same thing. It's also used often wrongly as a synonym for covert action. I would say it's actually a part of, you know, it's one of the strands of covert action, but it's not the same thing. And, you know, the same thing applies more recently to hybrid warfare. So the actual definition I would like to introduce in this, for disinformation is, you know, a triptych of disinformation. So you have disinformation, misinformation, and malinformation. Let me just go very briefly. So misinformation is false, but it's not necessarily shared with intent to deceive. Whereas disinformation is false, but is shared with intent to deceive. So someone retweeting, sharing on Facebook without realizing what they're sharing is false, that would be misinformation rather than disinformation, although the actual information may be the same thing. So the interesting one though is malinformation, which is true. It is harmful and it is shared with intent to deceive or do harm. So malinformation would be something like you compromised during the Cold War or more recently, whatever they've got on Donald Trump, that would be malinformation, I think. The next thing I just want to clarify is the difference between journalism and news, you know, and as an ex-journo myself, you know, we all aspire to do journalism. What we actually spend most of our time doing is news. So news is the generic output of news outlets. And don't get me wrong, there has to be some news. It can't be all journalism. No one would watch it, and it takes too long. But the gold standard is the journalism, which is the speaking of truth unto power. Now, what I'm arguing here in a broader context is that news can be both a conduit and a target of information and disinformation. What I'm really focusing on today, though, is journalism as a target and using Carole Cadwalladr as an example. But of course, if you follow this logic, media can be both a conduit to target media. That's not the case here because most of the targeting was done via social media. So let's move on. So Carole Cadwalladr's Brexit reporting, I'm talking about the 2017-18, probably about 18 months worth of stories, which basically unveiled what had been going on between everything that Emma's just been talking about with regard to Brexit, Cambridge Analytica, and also the links with SCL. Now that is really where it gets interesting, and there isn't time to go into all that now. But that, you know, I would say my analysis of the reporting, and I'm interested to hear Carole's views on this, is that there are obvious links between them, but there were also obvious links between Vote Leave and Leave.eu because they were kind of working to the same script. And that is why her reporting posed such jeopardy, because they liked to present as being completely separate. The other main strand to the reporting over that time was, you know, the scoops, the interviews with Chris Wiley, and I would really recommend his book, by me, and also Shamir Sani, who was working in the Vote Leave campaign, the spin-off part of it with Darren Grimes. But all of that really threatened, if more people had been reading it, it would have threatened to completely undermine the Brexit campaign. So it had to be delegitimized. It had to be kind of taken off the agenda. So therefore, there was a backlash to it. Now, this backlash took many forms. Perhaps the most famous one is describing Carole Cadwalladr as crazy cat lady. I would take that as a compliment myself, but obviously it's not. But she was also described as being obsessed, as being cuckoo. There were various different themes which emerged from this, which basically boiled down to being ridicule of Carole Cadwalladr as a person, but also ridicule of Carole Cadwalladr as a journalist. So really undermining her professional competence. There wasn't any kind of pattern in which themes were used by which campaign, which is another reason why I think there were closer links between them than they would like us to believe. But again, perhaps that's another paper. So my conclusions, and I can go into this in more detail if anyone wants to email me afterwards or in the questions, are that the journalism posed such jeopardy to the reputations and perhaps the whole Brexit project in general, such jeopardy that it had to be brought down. So, and this was done with disinformation primarily and malinformation. Now, if we want to get technical, the distinction between those two in this case isn't always clear because a lot of it is a matter of opinion. So if you take one of the things that they threw at Carole on social media, this came from both sides, actually, is that she was obsessed. Now, is obsession a bad thing for a journalist? I would say no, obviously. If you're not obsessed, you probably are not going to be an investigative journalist in the first place. So whether you classify that as disinformation or malinformation, there is an element of judgment involved there, but it's definitely one or the other because it's being presented as a negative. And taken in collision with all the other epithets which were being thrown, including the infamous airplane video, where Carole's face is superimposed onto a scene from Airplane the film, where there is a cue to slap the woman sitting in the airplane seat and her face is on that of the woman. So this is an obvious threat. And again, this is really complicated because some of these threats are emanating from the Russian embassy via Aaron Banks. So, there is a real threat behind that. So, so disinformation was used to such an extent which mirrors the jeopardy posed by the journalism in the first place. Not all the disinformation, broadly defined, was gendered. So actually, I have to spring to Dominic Cummings' defence here. His reaction to the journalism was quite extreme, but it wasn't gendered. Mainly, it was about disparaging all journalists, not just Carole Cadwalladr, and he didn't actually use the gender that often. It was the Leave.eu campaign, which was very, very misogynistic, really bad. I mean, Aaron Banks and Andy Wigmore, obviously have no respect for women in general, and were very happy to use this gender as a way of trying to delegitimize the journalism. And now obviously this feeds into wider societal gender hierarchy. So they're using the society's views of women as a weapon. But I would ultimately continue the argument that it's not just about gender. Journalism was the target. If gender hadn't been an issue, they would have picked on something else. So gender's seen as a weakness. But if it hadn't been that, it would have been class, it would have been race, it would have been sexuality if any of those had applied in this case. Look at the treatment of Shamia Sani in the outing of him, including to his family, in Pakistan, which was obviously a threat. So if it hadn't been gender, it would have been something else. If this is just something which they use to get back at the journalism, and the journalism is the ultimate target. So really what I've been talking about here is the backlash to the journalism about what Emma has been talking about and what Carole was writing about in the Observer 2 or 3 years ago. Obviously there are many parallels to what's going on now with COVID and misinformation and disinformation about that. So this is highly relevant. And I think the fact that journalism is targeted by big money, but SCL is owned by Robert Mercer, but also there are obvious links to the Russians as well. And the fact that they are targeting journalism in this way is a cause for concern. At that point, I will stop sharing my screen and hand back, if I can work out how to do it. And thank you. Thank you. I can't work out how to do it. Hang on, I will do it. You start.
It's the bit at the top. If you you have to. It's the sort of panel at the top. It looks
sharing. Yeah,
there you go.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay, brilliant. Brilliant. Thank you both for a real whistle stop kind of discussion of your research. So now I'd like to formally welcome Carole to perhaps respond to some of the issues that we've raised there. Welcome, and thank you for coming to the Media and Politics Group session today.
Hello, hi, nice to be here. Thanks for inviting me. Great to hear your presentations. I mean, that was kind of weird. That was slightly a weird experience, Natalie, watching that. But I'm not disagreeing with it, I have to say. And it's always, I found it very validating, I think, having external researchers look at this and say, actually, you weren't going mad, you were actually being targeted with propaganda. So it was a very difficult experience that still has had impacts to this day. So I'm always very appreciative when actually people come along and bring sort of independent, fresh eyes to it. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Did you, sorry, I don't know. Sorry, I'll let you. I'm not sure what else I can contribute at this stage. So
may I? May I jump in?
Yeah, go for it.
I wanted to comment on Natalie's paper because I want to take issue, if I may, and disagree a little bit, because I think, I mean, for me, attacking a woman journalist's credibility is by definition gendered, because of how differently women journalists are treated culturally, and how you know, how powerful that attack is. Because the thing is, you know, male journalists reporting on technology, a credibility attack is rebuffed in a very different manner. Okay, if somebody like Dominic Cummings criticizes a woman doing that, it has a very different effect. Partly, yes, because of the way in which, you know, people on LeVU and so on were attacking differently. And it has to be seen in that context, but also within a wider marginalization historically of women in serious journalism, okay? Mm-hmm. On politics, in, you know, on warfare, on technology, all these are male territory, yeah, in journalism. And, you know, women journalists are fighting back against that. Like, I mean, Carole, one of the leading ones, and that is a threat to male power and dominance in journalism, which is, you know, women are still struggling against in media. And I think, you know, credibility attacks, when they're trying to be a little bit more careful and not look like they're making misogynistic attacks, I'm sorry, but like, if you are attacking a woman's credibility and she is doing, you know, solid, truthful, accurate reporting, that has it plays a different role than if it was you were attacking a man.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I realize it's a nuanced point. Well, I suppose what I'm saying is that it's not that so let's say disinformation, for want of simplicity. It's not that disinformation wasn't gendered, it's just that gender wasn't the primary target. I think the effect of that disinformation is perhaps a slightly different question.
Yeah.
And that's why I say if it wasn't gender, it would have been class, it would have been race, it would have been sexuality, it would have been a number of other different things, because all of these things are seen as weaknesses if you have that worldview. Also, the other thing was that not all of the actors involved in the disinformation campaign were using gender. Dominic Cummings really wasn't. I hate to defend him.
But would he not have known how this is going to affect a woman? I'm sorry, but like, he understands campaigns, he understands media.
He was targeting journalism rather than women. He really was. You know, he thinks all journalists are idiots, not just the female ones.
You know,
including the female ones.
Yeah. But it's you know, a really interesting research. I think, you know, this was such a horribly you know, difficult campaign targeting Carole as well. I mean, in the sense of like how many layers there were to this. Mm-hmm. And I think, if anything, the credibility attacks reinforced that misogyny. But I don't know. I mean, maybe
it definitely reflected misogyny. I mean, as I mentioned, Aaron Banks, Andy Wigmore. I think one of the reasons they got themselves in such hot water is because they didn't take Carole seriously in the beginning. And I'd be interested in Carole's view on this.
Yeah,
actually.
please.
When you were getting your scoops what was it, in 2017, you actually went for coffee, I think, in Pret a Manger with Andy Wigmore, and he basically said, sit down, what do you want to know? We've all had this experience, where they don't see you as serious, so they'll tell you, and they told you far more than they should have done. And then
with me.
which meant that further down the line they had to up the backlash in order to mitigate the effects of what they told you in the beginning. Which is that a fair interpretation?
Yeah, I think so. And it's sort of like, it's quite interesting, because I think I think my sense is that they don't really like where they've ended up, because it's sort of slightly destroyed their self-image. Because I think, they presented themselves as the kind of fun time guys and this sort of very laddish quality. And, I genuinely kind of connected well to them in that, they had a sense of humour and about themselves, and they were sort of chatty and outgoing. And so in that sense, it was a sort of like gift which kept on giving. But I think that the fact that they turned so aggressive and nasty towards me is that they essentially, I think they felt backed into a corner and they had no choice. But I don't think that's where they've wanted to be, because I think, they, apart from anything else, have slightly old-fashioned values, where I think possibly to attack a woman is not what, they want to be seen to be doing. And I don't know, I do wonder about that. I've sort of wondered about that on a personal level, because, they have daughters and wives and that kind of thing. And I always found the sort of Trumpianness of their posturing just sort of like inauthentic. It always felt like they were swept up actually in the moments and in sort of aping what Donald Trump was up to, but it wasn't actually, it was more ideologically extreme, I thought, than they were naturally. And so, yeah, I slightly feel that they've kind of like ended up in a place they didn't really want to be. That's my sort of, and now they don't really know how to get out of it.
That's really interesting, and perhaps as a result of their underlying misogyny.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I think that's, it's interesting. I'm not quite sure what I think about that. I mean, if you look at Aaron Banks's business, he's got women in sort of senior positions, but you can also say that, what was quite interesting in terms of the legal outcomes of what happened with them is that it was actually a woman's signature who was on the documents. So in terms of the findings against Leave EU, it wasn't Aaron Banks's name who was over it. It was actually his colleague Liz Bilney, whose name was in the frame. So I don't know. On the one hand, you've got senior women in senior positions. On the other hand, they're the ones carrying the can. So I'm not quite sure where you end up with that.
No, how interesting. Okay, thank you.
Okay. I was going to say, if I may, I'd like to see if any of our audience members have questions for either Emma, Carole or Natalie. Feel free to raise your hand or just shout.
There's an interesting question for Carole in the chat that I noticed.
Oh. Okay, so would you like me to read this out? So, Carole, did it feel that it was your journalism or you yourself that was under attack at the time? And did your male colleagues see it in the same way?
I mean, I think the intentionality was definitely for me to feel under attack. And it was definitely to sort of separate me from my news organisation. So by pinning it upon me as the individual and putting the pressure on me and separating me from the sort of editorial standards and gravitas and resources and, you know, credibility of the news organization was definitely a deliberate tactic. And I mean, my sort of takeaway from this whole thing is that I mean, I've ended up in a place where I just think disinformation just really works. It's incredibly effective. And, you know, I feel like I've been the target of propaganda, and I feel that it's had a lasting impact, and in very real life ways. So this is kind of, you know, manufactured online, but it has ongoing effects in terms of my life and my career. And it made me into a contested political figure, and that's a hard space to do journalism in. And so I am now seen as a legitimate target, as a sort of cultural hate figure, and that is baggage that I carry now into everything that I do. And so, you know, that sort of impacted upon my career choices and public visibility and all sorts of things ever since, really. So, and I think that that's all, that stuff is very, very poorly understood. And on the plus side, I think I've come to understand it. I mean, that's the sort of the thing about being, you know, reporting on disinformation, then becoming a target of disinformation means that you do sort of have this very visceral experience inside disinformation. So, you know, on the plus side, I feel that that's aided my understanding. On the minus side, it's a bit shit.
Well said.
Thank you for that really honest answer. I think it's really important to, you know, have that out there. I think we've got another question from Afzal. Would you like to come in verbally?
Yes, first of all, thank you very much, both Emma and Natalie, and indeed Carole as well. It's fascinating stuff. Emma, what you were exposing, sadly, if I might just make it a bit personal, brought me back 15 years ago when Nigel Oakes, who you will probably know, set up SCL, tried to recruit me to be an executive director in his company. And, you know, I think instincts are really very powerful. Whilst he was offering huge amounts of money, I smelt a rat. And of course, you've explained and described that rat very, very carefully and very vividly. But my point really is that both you and Natalie have revealed all sorts of nefarious ways and very effective ways in which disinformation is what you're describing, and Natalie is defined. But what it's doing, really, if I'm not being too simplistic, is smearing. And smearing is a tactic that's been used as part of our, sadly, as part of our political culture for generations, for decades. It's been part of democracy, sadly. Now, when we say sort of, when we accept, as we appear to, smear opposition politicians, we accept that as a, you know, okay thing. Sadly, de facto accept it. When it sort of goes into journalism, of course, it's hugely damaging and dangerous. And so my question to both of you really is how should we now review what we mean by speaking truth to power? I mean, are we really, are we defining power as within governments, or should we now not define power as resting in the public, where it really should do in a democracy? And to that end, I wonder if the fantastic research that both of you have done should be communicated to the public, so the public are aware. And they develop what I describe, and please use this term and credit it to me because I need all the citations I can get, what I describe as political hygiene, so that we have an inoculation, a public inoculation to a degree, against what is now becoming increasingly aggressive disinformation, smearing activities. And the excellent work that people like Carole are doing is ignored, it is discredited because they attack the individual, and of course they damage the life of that individual. But much more importantly, if I might say so, Carole, in some ways, they damage the society that you are trying to protect through your work. So anyway, I hope this is not too theoretical, but I just wonder whether we should publicize this fantastic work that you're doing in a much more open way, so that the public can understand what's really going on.
You go first, Emma.
Okay, I would love to do more of that, and I hope to. I think one of the things, if I may say also, not in anywhere near such an extent as Carole, but I also have been targeted during this whole thing, and it's been incredibly difficult and debilitating on my life, and trying to publish in the middle of all of what's going on, it's very, very difficult. These pressures, are aimed to erode your ability to function normally, and that's the whole point. Is like, and I think a lot of the ways in which I've been attacked have been somewhat more hidden, because I'm not like the big name that Carole is. And so it eats away, erodes your ability to get that message out. And that's the whole idea. That's all what they're trying to do here, as well as smearing people. But smearing works most effectively on people who have the big prominent name. And, so I've been attacked slightly differently, I would say. And I think all of this erodes our ability to get the message across to the public. And I am doing everything in my power to try to get that across, but it's difficult, is all I'm going to say. I think we need to collaborate more and to make sure that this is, I think the films that have come out have been very effective at getting that message across as well, because we need to break beyond the bubbles of, I don't want to say this, but like Guardian readers, and academics and people who already care, and try to get it out across, to new communities. And how we do that has to be through working with others to try to get that message across. I'm also very concerned that some of this has got miscommunicated out there. And I think sometimes just putting things out into the public, for example, the hindsight files, just putting things out into the public domain without explanation, without journalists actually going through it and, working on reporters that will translate that to people, has actually been unhelpful. I'm trying to think through how the hell do you do this in a way that can have more impact with really important insights and where they don't just get lost, okay? Because I think this is a really important point. Also, I think with, things like Facebook, okay, if we just to jump to a slightly different aspect of this, big, massive corporations like Facebook, massive contractors that, Cambridge Analytica were pretty small as far as defense contractors are, but, there are a lot of different companies that contract to our governments and produce, do the work of government in a completely hidden way. Mm. Why do we not have FOIA extended to that? It's been debated in Parliament before. In 2016, they were considering it, and it's, never happened. We need to expand transparency, not just into private companies contracting, but first, that's the first step. But also Facebook are as big as a country, and as powerful as such. They are, a massive transnational organization. We need some kind of FOIA process. We had really important whistleblowing and leaks coming this week. We need to see the internal, have an ability to obtain internal decision-making insights. And the only way we can do that is some kind of FOIA process, which would be, you know, obviously have to be something that will be enforced in the US. So I don't know, this needs to be advanced more in US political debate. I also think that, you know, like we're talking about access to research, you know, that would be valuable, but it still doesn't really show us Facebook's decision making. So I think, you know, greater transparency around private companies. I'm sorry, like they shouldn't be operating in the shadows.
Can I just jump in there? Both Emma's work and Carole's work I would classify as journalism, and the problem we have in getting it out there is that this journalism is then targeted with disinformation, which is delegitimizing and deterring, as I think you've both, you know, given evidence of, and that's why it isn't out there more. If that's being done by women, there's even more leverage to delegitimize and deter, which is kind of what I was saying. It's like the malinformation which has been used is using the, you know, the inherent societal hierarchies against us, and so it's much more difficult for us, A, to be taken seriously, and B, to actually not, you know, be subject to this backlash. So I think yes, I agree, Afzal, it's great, you know, it would be fantastic to get this out there. I mean, there's another question about whether anyone actually wants to listen to it, you know, because we're experts and we're female experts as well, which is, you know, double whammy really. But yes, certainly I am doing my best to get it out there, but it's not easy. Yeah. Your comment about smearing, yes, you're right, and this is part of the reason there is so much sort of noise around disinformation. It's because it's been part of so many different things over the years, but which is why I really try to define it very, very carefully. I could talk forever, so I stopped. But if anyone has any more questions.
Well, if you want to talk forever, I'm here and I'm all ears.
Okay, I'll give you a ring.
Very much. Thank you.
Really interested in your Nigel Oakes story, by the way. I will call you about.
Maybe Carole has a response to that.
I'm going to leave that one to you guys.
Okay.
Okay, lovely. Thank you. Does anyone? We've got about 4 minutes left. So, are there any other sort of quick final questions that people want to raise about any of the points made today or the research that's been presented? Feel free to post in the chat if people don't want to speak on the recording.
I could talk a little bit more about speaking truth onto power, actually. Sorry, Elaine.
Go for it.
You go ahead. I was just feeling the same.
This is a really brief question, but I'm sure I saw the advert for this event on Facebook.
No, Twitter.
I'm not on Twitter though. So, you know, how are they using our data? This is the thing, is we're just, you know, we all have WhatsApp on our phones. It's just, I know that you're talking about tiny bits of data, not that kind of data, but it's just so embedded. And I'm a Guardian reader, you know, I am the Guardian reader.
But we're all the Guardian reader.
We did Guardian off Facebook.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, and Guardian uses, you know, data for its own marketing purposes, of course, as well, you know, like, but, you know, I mean, the issue is surveillance capitalism, you know, like it's not just even Facebook, okay, you know, and yes, we're promoting events on Facebook. I mean, I didn't, because I don't really use it anymore, because like, eek, but you know, people are on Facebook, yeah. You know, you want to find people to get the alternative message across, you need to go to them on Facebook, because that's where they might be. Well, older generations. Actually, interestingly, my student just said to me yesterday, oh, I'm not on Facebook, I'm young. So it's like, okay, so we need to be talking about, you know, Snapchat and Instagram, but, you know, it's YouTube, and like, I think how we get this across to people will, you know, we need to be a bit more savvy about our ability to communicate, because I think, you know, it's very difficult to actually say, oh, don't go on Facebook or whatever, and then, you know, not use it to promote. I think we have to be where people are, sadly.
Yeah, and Emma's work, you see, what she's talking about is the way they target people with disinformation. So, you know, I think, you know, with the paper you're giving today, Emma, you're talking about how they're singling out people perhaps with mental health issues because they are particularly vulnerable to a certain type of information, whether it's dis or mal. And that's what Carole was also writing about back with Brexit, because that technique was that's basically how they won it, you know. So that's how they're using it. The actual technicals I can't explain. You know, you'd have to ask Alexander Nix, and he's the Russian guy. I've forgotten his name. He's the Russian guy who actually harvested all the. Yeah.
I would say that those, you know, it advanced way beyond that. I have a lot of the research and development papers and things, which I'm drawing on for my book when it publishes. And, you know, I mean, they were adding new data sets and developing further. And so that's why I think, you know, this new, you know, we need to be thinking about it slightly differently and focusing on the neurotics and the mental health issues, and depression and anxiety, and how those were utilized to drive, because we've seen a development even, you know, even if you look at the 2016 campaign, I would say that, you know, conspiracy theories were not playing as big a role. You look today and it's advanced into a realm where paranoia is being weaponized in a much more sophisticated and, you know, systematic way. And that is very concerning. And we didn't focus enough on trying to understand how they were using data. And I think if those, you know, political scientists who actually did the experiments to try to measure the effectiveness of the methods had actually thought about this, we would have anticipated how this was going to, you know, work out in relation to the recent events and campaigns.
Yeah, I agree. I think Brexit, you know, the whole 2016 Brexit and Trump now looks quite antiquated compared to January the 6th, for example. So yeah, we need to keep up with this because it's really important. I would again refer back to this book. If you want to understand how it all came about, this book is very good, Christopher Wiley's book.
Okay, everyone, sorry to interject, but we've now reached the end of the time. It's now 5 o'clock. So I just want to thank all of you for contributing to this really interesting discussion around misinformation, disinformation, etc. And I'll be sharing, my colleague James will be sharing the recording in a while on our Twitter account, so look out for it if you want to spread some of that information a bit further. So thank you all, and for the questions as well.
Thanks very much.
Thank you for inviting us. It's great to join you. Thank you ever so much.
Bye. Take care.